Okay, we're ready.
All right.
What's the date?
What's today's date?
Yeah.
Today's date is June 10th,
What year?
2018.
All right.
So I haven't given a talk for a while, so bear with me a little bit. I've been thinking about doing this actually for quite a long time. And I'm going to take my hearing aids off because I hear myself too much. And I thought it was important that I tell you the history of the Wickstrom family and the McFee family. And we're going to talk about both sides. And I think what we got to remember is my grandfather is your great-grandfather. And my great-great-grandfather, no, my great-grandfather is your Colin Richards' great-great-grandfather. And because we're going to go back to the 1850s, but they're your relatives too. So it'd be nice to know a little bit about them. And then we're going to go through time. I got it sort of scripted, but most of it I'm going to ad-lib because there's some stories that I want to tell. I can't tell you the stories about the 1850s because I wasn't even there. And we're going to tag team it a little bit. We're going to start off with talking about the Wickstrom side of the family, and I'm going to point to some pictures. They won't mean a lot to you, but it'll help me keep my brain straight. My great-grandparents migrated from Ireland and Sweden in what I figure is somewhere between 1850 and 1870 time frame. Their last names were Shield. My mother's maiden name was Shield. And her mother's name was Hart, H-A-R-T. This really old picture up here, the baby in that seat, as I've been told, is my grandmother, Mary Shield. And then the rest of it is the Hart family. All of our relatives that came from Ireland and Sweden were farmers. Maybe that's how you and Richard got so well connected. But most of people's ancestors were farmers. And they farmed until, I'm going to have to back up every once in a while because I'll get a little confused. The Wickstrom side of the family, the family folklore has it, is they came to the United States, their name was Anderson. And when they came to the United States and went through the immigration, they were told, you know, there's so many Andersons here, you need to pick another Swedish name. So they picked the name Wickstrom. So, and that's something that that hopefully you guys will remember for a long time, and you'll pass this down to your children. Some of the stuff that I'm going to tell you today, and hopefully, you know, you'll all get together sometime, maybe 10 years from now, and you know, I remember that day when Grandma and Grandpa Wickstrom told us the stories that we're going to be telling you today. So this couple here are my mom and dad's, it's my grandma and grandpa Shield, Mary Shield and Grandpa Tom Shield. Mary Shield died when I was about 3 or 4 years old. I remember a little bit about her. The one thing I remember about her actually was her funeral, because I remember when I went to her funeral, the curtains in the funeral home were like this maroon red, and it's always been in my head, because I went to the funeral, I was only 3 years old or so. My grandma Shield died at about 62 years of age, and she died of cancer. They had 10 children. This is my grandma and grandpa Shield. This lady here is my mom, who all of you know.
And she was the
And you
baby.
can, I still remember all of their names when I look at them. But you can go ahead and pass that
Pass
around.
it this way, actually, first.
As you can see, my mom had 9 siblings. It was a big Irish Catholic family. And while I was gathering stuff, I've had this. This is it's not really a poem, but it's a poem that my grandma Mary Shield wrote, and maybe somebody put all this together. I'm going to read it to you. It's not really long. I sensed that it was something that she wrote probably when she knew she was going to die. You know, her cancer had gotten bad and so forth. As it goes, I am an aged woman now, but 'twas not always so. I get sentimental about this stuff. I raised my children one by one and watched them come and go. Out in the cold world they all went and did their bit so well that I am proud that I've been spared the wondrous tale to tell. 6 stalwart boys, 4 lovely girls. 'Tis been my lot to bear. They have done honor to my name. Their success now I share. I've not been blessed with worldly goods to a very marked degree, but my children all are proud to come and spend time with me. My journey here will soon be over, and when I hear the call, I'll feel I have not lived in vain. I've given the world my all. This is my grandma. So, I just found this actually yesterday.
Where was it at? Where'd you have it?
It's in a drawer.
Was it?
Was
Okay.
it in Grandma's?
You know, when Grandma died, she probably had it stuck away. All of my relatives. I gotta back up a little bit. This lady here is my grandma's mom. Her last name was Casey.
No, that was your dad's mom, wasn't it?
No.
Okay.
Oh, yes. My dad's mom. This is my dad's grandma, my great-grandma Casey. I don't remember meeting her, so she probably died before I was born. This lady here, who Colin and Richard know quite well, is my grandma Wickstrom, my dad's mom. And this is my grandpa Wickstrom. Grandpa Wickstrom's first name was Paul. I remember my grandpa very well. And he died in his mid-60s. He died from Parkinson's disease. You know, a lot of this information is just good information to have because you know it's in your genes. So. They all settled in Iowa and Missouri and were farmers. In the early 1900s, my grandparents on both sides, my mom and dad's mom and dad, they all moved to Des Moines, Iowa, which in the early 1900s was a growing city, is today, and that's where I was born, was in Des Moines. They were all factory workers. And my grandpa Wickstrom actually worked there was a Ford assembly plant in Des Moines, Iowa, and he worked there as a painter for quite a few years. My dad had one older sister. Her name was Irene. This girl here. And she married Lou Backroat. Lou Backroat, I'll talk about him a little bit later. Without Lou Backroat, the Wickstrom car dealerships would have never existed. He was the one that loaned my dad and became my dad's partner when Wickstrom Chevrolet opened. My uncle Lou Backroat was a very successful car dealer in Rockford, Illinois, and his sons and now his grandkids run that dealership in Rockford, and they also have a couple large dealerships in Florida. My mom and dad were born and raised in Des Moines, Iowa, and my dad joined the Navy just before World War II and was a fighter pilot. This is my dad. Colin and Richard remember my dad really well. This is a picture of my dad in his airplane that he used to fly on and off aircraft carriers during World War II.
Is that a Corsair that he flew? What do you fly? Do you remember the name of the plane?
I do, but I don't remember at this time.
Wasn't it a Spitfire?
No, the Spitfire actually was a European plane. The English flew it. So, and when we, I need the turret glasses. I just actually ran across this thing too as I always thought my dad actually joined the Navy before World War II started. I have no idea why, he probably just wanted to fly airplanes. But he was madly in love with my mother. My mother was 17 years old when they met, and they got engaged at 18 years old, and they got married when they were 19. And I ran across this, actually my sister...
Your dad was actually 2 years older than your mother.
Right. This is
3 years.
This is something that my sister Kathy put together and gave it to my mom, obviously as some sort of a Christmas gift, because she found it. And it's like a little pact that my mom and dad signed together, obviously probably when they got engaged, because they got married in 1942, and this thing is dated August 18th, 1941. And here's, here's what it says. We love each other more than anything else in the world, and will never, ever, ever let anything come between us. Dated August 18th, 1971, and it says, all my love, and my dad signs it Dick, and my mom signs it Eileen. So, why don't you take a look at that and pass that around the table.
It's pretty cute.
My mom and dad got married. This is my mom and dad's wedding picture, right here. My dad was obviously a Navy officer at that time. And I'm sure shortly after they were married, he went off to the Pacific to do his war thing. But he was gone for less than a year, as I understand it. And then when he was back here, he trained pilots, and he was only overseas for about a year. So I think, Gail, I'm going to let you do your... Okay. So your grandma Gail is going to now talk about the same stuff I just got through talking about.
Well, I know much more about my mother's parents than I do about my father's parents. My sister even had history done on them. My great-grandparents on my mother's side are originally from Ireland and Scotland. My great-great-grandfather, James McCarthy, immigrated from Ireland in the 1860s. My great-grandmother, Mary Cashel, was born in Illinois, and my grandmother told me she was fourth generation born in Illinois. So 2 generations before that had already immigrated from Ireland. Mary Cashel was from, her family was from Scotland. My grandparents.
How do you spell Cashel?
Cashell. My grandparents were both born in Chicago, James Richard McCarthy and Mary Agnes Flaherty. Grandpa was a salesman for Libby Food Company. Grandma worked at the Chicago Stockyards and knew Upton Sinclair. Now, do you know who Upton Sinclair is? He wrote the book, The Jungle. Also, when she worked there, she was approached by a photographer named Charles Gibson. And he had trunks of clothes that he took around the United States, and he paid young women that he thought were pretty to be models for penny postcards. And this picture up here and this picture here are the actual penny postcards of my
You can see
grandmother.
their posed pictures.
Yeah, and they weren't her clothes, they were, so when you hear the term Gibson girls, people always think that it's a hairstyle. It's not, it's the girls that he hired, and then these penny postcards got sold all over the United States. So that was Grandma's claim to fame. Now, my father's parents, and because my parents died so young, and my father was the youngest by far in his family, I don't know a whole lot about his family. My grandfather's was Alexander McFee, and my grandmother was Marguerite Hesterman. We think Grandpa was Scottish, and Grandma was German. I'm pretty sure my grandfather emigrated, and my cousin told me that they were from the Isle of Skye off the coast of Scotland. And but since so much of that my family died young, I don't know a whole lot more about that. My father was in the Army in the Pacific for 3.5 years, and if you see here, here's a picture of him in his uniform and holding his machine gun. And I don't have the whole picture there. He had on short shorts. I have all these pictures
Because it was
from
hot
that time.
there.
It was very hot there. And when Tim and I are going through the box, I have a box over there with over 100 letters from my mother, from my father to my mother.
This is one of the letters. You can see they were all addressed, actually this one here went to Madison, Wisconsin. Gail will tell you a little bit about that.
So he enlisted after Pearl Harbor. So he went in 42, and he stayed in until the war ended in 45. My mother enlisted in 43, and she was a Wade, and she was stationed at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And when my father got home, when he was let out, this is their wedding picture. They were married in the chapel at the University of Wisconsin, because that's where she was stationed.
Just a side note on these letters, we don't have any letters that Gail's mom wrote to her dad, but when you were in the Pacific, it isn't like they were fighting a war every day. You were just sort of, you were stationed
Most
there,
of his
and you had a
letters
lot
talk
of time
about-
on your hands. He
Most
has
of-
beautiful handwriting.
I was just gonna say that. Most of his letters are very long and his biggest complaint was boredom.
Yeah.
And they also aren't redacted, so I don't know what action he saw. He got commendations, but he never talked about it, so I don't know if,
Yeah, my dad never talked much about the
Neither
war
did he.
either. So, why don't you put the letters down for now, though? You're welcome to read them, and there's another 100 of them in a box, and it's pretty amazing.
all right. Oh, you're back up,
My turn again?
yeah.
Okay. Hopefully. So, now we're going to talk a little bit. We're sort of through the war, and let me talk a little bit about the war. I wasn't born yet. But my mom was 19 when she got married, and my dad was 21 or 22, and they were stationed in the United States when my dad wasn't overseas flying the airplane. And if you can imagine my mom, pregnant, 19 years old, having to drive from Florida to Oregon in probably a 15-year-old car with my dad.
Where you can't drive at night and have
Well, you,
windows.
well, you could in the middle of the country. You couldn't drive at night along the coast. So, but I know he was stationed in Oregon, he was stationed in San Diego, he was stationed in Texas, and my mom always was with him when he was in the States.
And
So
St. Simon's
if you
Island.
could just imagine what traveling like that could have been, because they didn't have nice new cars like us, they didn't have any money, and there weren't any new cars during the war anyways. I'm sure their car was at least 10 years old. Stick shift, they didn't have radios in cars back then, and they got through life. They were very young, and nobody had any money. So after my dad got out, after the war ended in August of 1945, my dad went to work for Chevrolet, the car company. And he worked out of Des Moines, and he called on car dealers all around Iowa. I remember as a kid, when the new cars would come out, they'd have like parties at the dealerships. And I remember my dad took me one year with him as he traveled around to all the dealerships around Iowa. And you'd always do it on the week the new cars were coming out. But this is a picture of the first house that I lived in after I was 2 or 3 years old. It was sort of you see a house like this. There's a house on Barrington Road, just as you go past the Y turn when it turns into 59 and you go straight and it stays Barrington Road. There's a couple houses that are very similar to this. And these were typical houses that were built after the war to accommodate 2 or 3 kid families. And that was the first house I lived in. It was a brand new house. My parents had it built. I'm going to say we moved into it in about 1948. I had an older brother, Terry, and an older sister, Kathy. Both died of cancer. We'll talk about them a little bit. So in 1954, my dad was transferred to Chicago. And he worked downtown in the Merchandise Mart, was where Chevrolet's offices were. And he still called on dealers, but that's where his office was. And when we moved from Des Moines to Chicago, this was the house that I grew up in. I moved into this house when I was in first grade, and we lived in it until we moved into Roselle. And a quick story about this house. When Ray Tobin, a fraternity brother of mine, was in our store last week, and he lives in Evanston, and it's just that I could have Ray go over to this house and take a picture of it. And that's what he did. And he texted or emailed it to me. This picture makes it look a little bit nicer than it was as I remember it, but you know, it's in Evanston, so I'm sure over the years somebody has replaced all the windows, resided it, freshened it up. When I lived in it, there were 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a nice big living room, a nice kitchen, dining room. But and when we moved into it, it was only me and my older brother and sister. But Casey, my other brother, was born right when we were moving, and then 2 more kids were born. So ultimately, we lived in that home with 6 kids and mom and dad. Me and my older brother lived in the attic. A piece of it was finished off, and they called it a bedroom. It didn't feel like a bedroom in August when it was 110 degrees up there. Houses weren't air conditioned then, so I remember as a kid during the summer we'd go down and we'd sleep on my mom and dad's floor because it was so hot in the house. I'm going to talk about my brothers and sisters a little bit, and then maybe you'll talk about your brothers and sisters.
Right here, Dad.
This one.
I think she's got it.
Yes, that's the picture. This is a picture of me and my brothers and sisters and my mom. I'm gonna guess I was about Josh's age, probably 12, 13. That's me. My older brother Terry, my sister, my younger sister Julie, D-Boy, everybody knows Danny, and everybody knows Casey. There you go, Ella. While we're on my brothers and sisters, this is a picture of
What?
all my brothers and sisters. Everybody's probably seen this before. Here's your Porky Grandpa. It was actually after I saw this picture that I decided I needed to lose about 25 pounds. And I did right away. This is my older sister, Kathy. She actually died about a month after this picture was taken. She died of colorectal cancer, and the blonde hair was a wig. She actually had, well, by that time her hair was either gray or, she had dark hair and it turned gray. So, and it's all my brothers and sisters and their spouses. So, you knew most of those people there. Why don't you talk about your brothers and sisters?
Whatever you want to do.
Yeah. And also, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. After World War II, my father went to work for a company called General Box. Not quite sure what he did there, but he got on the train and went to Des Plaines. They purchased a lot in Roselle and built a small shell of a house. When I say small, it was 2 tiny bedrooms, a bathroom, a little living room, and a kitchen. And right here, that's the next one. Okay, right here is my sister Karen sitting in the yard and Gary on the porch. And my father built this house. They built the shell. They lived in it while they were doing it.
You can see the garage being built right there.
Oh yeah, and this is the garage being built. And my mother had 4 kids in 4.5 years. So as soon as, and I was the oldest and the most mobile, so I didn't live with my parents. I was sent to live with my grandparents. And I didn't live with them until I went to kindergarten. And people go, does it feel weird? I go, it didn't seem strange to me. You know, I mean, I would visit my parents on the weekend. My grandparents would take me out and I would see them. And sometimes I would live with different ones. And they rented a room in their house to a merchant marine. And I always thought it was the coolest thing because he had a ship in a bottle. And that's what I remember most about that time. After Patty was born 10 years later, we had the 4 of us lived in 1 bedroom. We had, it was probably 9 by 12 and it had 2 sets of bunk beds in it. And so all 4 of us slept in there. And then Patty was born and she lived in the bedroom with my parents. So my dad added an addition on both sides of the house. And that's the one, did you just pass that one, Tim? Mm-hmm. That's not when it got added onto, and that ended up having a 2nd bathroom, so that was really luxurious to us. Then my father went to work for himself as a cabinet maker. My mother was a secretary for a Gitz Plastic Company in Roselle. I went to St. Walter's Grade School and Lake Park High School. I worked at Shirl's Drive-In in Roselle as a car hop for a short time and then became the cook. Now we're going to tell the us story. Oh, well, as I'm the oldest of 5. And then we had Gary, who passed away, and Karen, Ken, and Patty. And Patty was 10 years after my brother. So she was 14 years younger than I was. Okay, now we're back to us.
To what?
Us.
Okay. The house that Gail grew up in is the only house that I ever saw her in. You know,
It's the only house they ever lived in.
It was the house that when she got married. When we got married, she lived in that house. We used to sit out in the driveway and make out. So we moved to Roselle. I'm gonna In the early 60s, while my dad was working for Chevrolet, he was given an assignment with a couple other people. Guys know where Roselle is, right? Back in those days, Roselle was a rural town. Once you got past O'Hara Field, the population hadn't really spread that far. The homes hadn't been built yet. And my dad was assigned to study the roadways. You had to go all the way to Elgin to find a Chevrolet car dealership. So he was assigned by Chevrolet to figure out where they should put a Chevrolet dealer or maybe another Chevrolet dealer as the suburbs sprawled to the west. And they thought that there should be a Chevrolet dealer in Roselle on Irving Park Road. They thought that Irving Park Road would be the big 4-lane road that would bring Elgin to the city. Gulf Road, where all the car dealers are, in Woodfield, in 1963, 1960, that was all cornfields. So he went into his boss, because my Uncle Louis, who was a successful car dealer, him and my dad started, he probably told my dad, what we ought to do is figure out how you become the Chevrolet dealer in Roselle, and I'll loan you the money to do that. They became partners. So he went into his boss, and his boss's name, by coincidence, I remember because my dad was always close with his Chevrolet bosses. His name was Harry O'Boyle. And Harry O'Boyle just also happened to have been my dad's football coach in high school. So they were very well connected, even though he was probably, at least 15 years older than my dad. So he goes in, he says, he probably called him Harry or Mr. O'Boyle. He called him Harry when they were alone. He says, how about letting me open that Chevrolet dealership? And he said yes. So and what happened is the Pickwick grocery store, which used to be right next door to it. I don't know if you remember that grocery store. Okay. They actually bought that property 2 years ago and tore it down. There was a grocery store there. But the guy that owned the grocery store actually built the building for my dad to his specs. And my dad and our family actually rented it to him until Casey bought it about 15 years ago. So here we are moving from the city to Roselle, a farm town. We didn't think that was very cool. But this is the first house we lived in. It's on Pine Street in the old area of Roselle. That house is still there today. When we moved in, I'm sure my parents rented it because you got to remember, my mom and dad, when they started this car dealership, they had no money. They're sending all their kids to Catholic grade schools and high school. My sister was in college. I know when you work for Chevrolet and you got 6 kids, you don't have extra money in your pocket. You're sort of living hand to mouth. But when the dealership opened, it took off like gangbusters. And then another interesting point, back in the mid-60s, Chevrolet sold 35% of all the vehicles that were sold in Chicago. It was, Chevrolet was the thing. And Ford was right behind that too. So that's our first house in Roselle. Then this house, after my dad was in business for about 2 years, this house is on Acacia Lane in Medina, and that's the house that really my younger brothers and sisters grew up in, and I lived in that house my senior year of high school. It's still there today. It still looks the same. Told you about my Uncle Louis. In 1963, we opened. Something else happened when I came to Roselle. I met this girl. This is Gail at about 18 years old, we think.
Yeah.
Maybe just out of high school. And we fell in love when we were 16 years old. And this picture here was the picture that sat on my desk when I was in the Navy. You lived in your a stateroom, and I'd look at it all the time. I still look at it all the time. So, the story about how we met, I say she was a car hop at Cheryl's Drive-In, and we just met and started going out. She insists that I went to the Catholic grade school parish hall where we had a teen night once a month where
Terry
you'd
Madigan brought it.
socialize and dance, and that's where we met. But that's that story. Well, we've been married. We'll be married 50 years this coming March, and we've been together for 55 years. Gail graduated from Lake Park High School in 1965, and she went to Northern Illinois University for 1 year until there was no money left. Her parents really didn't have the money to send her to college. So I graduated from St. Viator High School and attended Marquette University. When Gail came back from college, she went to work for Western Electric. Why don't you tell them what you did?
I was a key punch operator. That's the pre-core to computers. We had cards that you typed a machine and it put holes in it, and then a computer read it. And I got bored real quick, so I learned to fix them, so they didn't have to call people in to fix them. So when I went back to college a year later, they hired me back in the summer, which they're not allowed to do, and I worked the night shift because they got 2 in 1 for me because I had learned to fix them. And,
If it broke, she could fix
I
it,
could
and
fix it.
so everybody else couldn't say, can't work, it's broken. So Gail says, I'll fix it. It's not that hard. So when I went away to college, the Vietnam War had started in about 1964, 1965. My brother Terry actually joined the Marines at 18 years old. Actually, he joined at 17. He wasn't a real good student, and he was sort of a troublemaker. And so he joined the Marines. And he told my mom that he joined the Marines, and she said, you can't do that, you're 17. And he said, I can do it if Dad signs for me, and he's already signed for me. So I'm in. So him and my dad never got along really well. So, yeah, you want to be a Marine? Sure, here, go off and have a good time. But 6 months later, he was in Vietnam fighting the war. And his primary job in the Vietnam War was he was a forward
radio operator.
Forward radio operator. And he was the guy that, say, they wanted to bomb our pier out there. He said, they'd give him the coordinates, and he said, go ahead and drop napalm on that pier. And then we always laughed about it. He also say, and don't be short, because if you're short, you're going to drop it on me. Because I'm sure he was between here and there. That's how they, so that was 1965. In 1966, my sister Kathy was graduating from Marquette, and she wanted to do something. She wanted to give back, and she joined the American Red Cross and to go to Vietnam. And my sister served in forward MASH units as a hand holder and a letter writer for people that got shot. And she was over there for 100 years, or for about a year. And I found these. I knew I had them, but I came across them. And I have an envelope with pages and pages of letters that she wrote home to my mom. And my mom typed them. And they're there for everybody to read at your leisure. When you're over here one day and you want to take a half hour and read my sister's letters home from Vietnam, they're in there. I'll make sure they're out, but it's interesting reading.
Well, she also stayed with the Red Cross another year, and she spent a year traveling the whole United States as a representative and speaker for the Red Cross.
She was quite a woman. So I'll leave those out so that they're here for the summer. So when you're here, any one of you, I'm sure, would really enjoy reading them. So in 1969, I graduated, I don't want to get ahead of myself. Gail and I got engaged the summer of 1968. I was going to be a senior. I knew I was going to go in the Navy because I was in ROTC, and so we wanted to get married. So we got married in March, and after I graduated, my first assignment was to go to firefighting school in Philadelphia. And so I graduate, we essentially had no money, but my dad, we always had a car to drive. My dad gave me a car. I don't remember my dad ever giving me any money or loaning me any money. Somehow we just figured it out. And the first place that we lived in was one of those 3-story houses where the owner lives on the first floor, and then they rent out the second floor and the third floor, and then we rented the very top floor attic, and we rented that for 3 months while I was going to firefighting school. In October, Colin was due to be born, so she came home about a month before he was born, and I had to stay at firefighting school and finish that up. So in late October, Colin was born, mid-October. And 6-8 weeks after that, I was on my way to the ship that I was on. There's the ship right there, proof that it exists. And it was stationed in Alameda, California.
What was the name of the ship?
The USS Vega, V-E-G-A. And I spent my whole time on that ship. After I was to the ship, I was there. And we had a great time. Colin was a little baby, but we were in California, and we'd drive to Lake Tahoe, and we'd drive down to Big Sur, and we'd go to San Diego, and it was a lot of fun. But Navy work was hard work. We were preparing to go overseas again. So in the summer of 1970, in August, we knew that my ship was going to be going to Vietnam. So Gail and I and Colin, who was less than 1 at this time, we drive back from California, and the car that my dad gave us to drive, I remember it was a
Chevelle.
It was a tan Chevelle. I think tan or green. Your mom had a green one.
Tan.
So we drove back.
No air conditioning.
I spent about a week at home, and then Gail and my dad drove me to O'Hare Field, and I got to ride on one of those brand new 747s, flying back to San Francisco to catch my ship to go to Vietnam.
Did you fly in your Navy uniform
Yes.
back then?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. There's a little bit of a story to that. Number one, you would fly at a discounted rate. But whenever I would fly, my boss, my immediate boss, he was only a couple of years older than me. He was the engineering officer. His name was Scott Simonson. And he told me, whenever you fly, you wear your uniform and you look sharp. He said, professional pride. I was proud to be a Navy officer. So I'd wear I didn't worry about the war protesters and that kind of stuff. I was just proud to be a Navy officer and to serve our country. So off my ship goes to Vietnam, and it's hard. Colin was a year old. Gail was now at home. Did you live with your mom and dad or my mom, or
I
sort of
lived
both?
I lived with my mom and dad for a little while, and then I couldn't stand being around my brothers, so I moved to your parents' house.
Okay. So, it wasn't good living. There was tight spaces and,
Yeah.
but
I shared a bedroom with Julie.
my sadness was I was away from Gail and Colin. It's very lonely. And I say this so that we remember our service people now when they're on deployment in a way. It's very hard to be away from your family. You know, when you're not doing your work, I just would sit there and write letters like her dad.
I have a box of those.
Yeah, she has a box of letters too. It's funny, if you read the letters, they essentially say the same thing. You do the same thing every day, so you don't make up new stuff. But her letters are actually in a shoebox in one of the drawers in there. And she wrote me all the time, but guys don't save that kind of stuff. The interesting thing is, I take Gail and Colin back home, and after I was gone about a month, in a letter, she tells me she's pregnant with Richard. So she was pregnant when I left, and
That was on purpose.
and then I came home in April. We were gone 8 months. I came home in April, and Richard was born 2 weeks later. I don't have a picture of it, but when we lived on Yerba Buena Island. If you look at a map of San Francisco, there's an island between Oakland and San Francisco that's called Treasure Island, Yerba Buena Island, and we lived in a little World War II cottage that they used during the war. And right next to it was a great big cottage, and that's where the Admiral lived. It was right next to our house. And when you go back to San Francisco, if you have time, you need to drive out to Yerba Buena Island. Our house, it was there a couple of years ago. It's probably still there. It was built before the World War II, so I'm sure it's just crumbling down. And Treasure Island's no longer a Navy base, but you can drive onto those two islands. They're connected. Treasure Island connects to Yerba Buena Island, and it was a landfill in the 1930s for a World's Fair that was held in San Francisco. So, right next to Treasure Island also is the island of Alcatraz. You know the island of Alcatraz? Okay. You know the island of Alcatraz prison?
Yeah.
When we were living there, Colin was a year and a half. Richard was just born. The Indians took over Alcatraz. It was a protest back and they occupied it for like a year. So that's my Alcatraz story. When I came back from the Navy, we lived in this house. That house is in Bartlett. We rented it. It had 2 bedrooms. Colin and Richard lived in the front bedroom. And you probably don't even remember that house, but
We drove by it with Caleb
yeah.
2 years ago.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
We lived there for about a year and a half until one day Gail said, we need to buy a house. And as I don't remember ever going and buying our first new house, but I'm sure I was somewhat involved. I sort of worked all the time. I was a young car salesperson. And did Caleb go by this house too?
We did. Me, you, and Caleb.
So we bought that house. It's only about 5 minutes from the Chevrolet dealership. It's in Elk Grove Village. And we bought that house in 1973. Gail, I need you to come over and be a part of this part of the story.
All right.
In late 1973, Gail's mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. And, you know, back pre-80s, if you had cancer, if you had a bad cancer, there wasn't much they could do. The chemotherapy hadn't been invented. Basically, if they did surgery, they just went in and hacked it out and usually didn't live through it. And then on January 1st of 1974,
Well, wait, before that, in November, Kenny was in a car crash. The driver fell asleep. They hit the back of a flatbed truck, and the top of his skull was crushed and his neck was broken.
Yeah.
And that was in November.
that was in November.
And then right after that, my mother had a second surgery, and they just closed her up and said there's nothing they can do.
And then on January 1st, 1974,
Gary fell out of a tree.
Gary fell out. Gary was, they were living in an old house and they wanted to build a fire in the fireplace. He climbed up the tree not very far and he fell out of it. And he lived the next 40 years as a paraplegic.
On the 28th of January, my mother passed away.
The 28th, she passed away.
And then in October, my father passed away.
And then in October, her father passed away.
That
And
was
I
all
guess-
in 74.
This is 1974. So obviously, when your mom passed away, Patty was only 10 years old. And I don't think any of you people have met Patty, any of the grandkids. Have you ever
The
met
girls
Patty?
did.
Yeah, Caleb met her too.
Okay. But Patty came to live with us with 10. Now, you got to remember this young girl, she lost both of her parents at the age of 10. So a very traumatic thing happened to her. It happened to all of us. And then her older brother became a paraplegic. And also back in the 1970s, if you're a paraplegic, they didn't have much to do for you. You know, you're a paraplegic. So, but it became obvious to us that Patty needed to come live with us. There was nobody else. Karen wasn't married. Carrie was a paraplegic, and Kenny couldn't have taken care of her. So Patty came to live with us and became a part of our family. And this is a picture of us in about 1976, I'm going to guess, by looking at Colin and Richard. Maybe 75. Patty was probably in 6th grade. If you pass that actually down to Colin might remember that yellow outfit he had on.
Oh yeah, Grandma bought it for me.
Do you remember you saw it in
At Marshall Fields,
and you wanted
yep.
it, and I wouldn't buy it for you, so you called Grandma and she bought it for you?
Yes.
Grandma would buy him all nice shit. Actually, I'm sure Grandma bought Richard that really white outfit
match,
too. And Grandma would, my Grandma Wick, who all of you know, would buy the nice clothes. We'd buy the cheap stuff for him. So, I'm about done. So now we live in this little, actually this house that we had in Elk Grove Village, we filled it up pretty quick once Patty came to live with us. And it also, you know, back unless you were really rich, you only had one bathroom. You just learned to share. I don't know what we did with all of our towels. And I think maybe you only got a towel a week. But it was a 3-bedroom home with 1 bathroom. It did have a half bath downstairs that actually Colin had his mouth washed out in once.
Remember, Colin, you remember what you did?
All right, well, the reason why Colin got his mouth washed out is he had one of those plastic baseball bats. And on the side of the house, he was banging the house with this thing and put all kinds of dent. It wasn't wood siding.
Aluminum siding.
It was aluminum. And he put all the... And I went out and I busted the bat. And I'm sure I yelled at him. And he went, "Nah, Grandma will buy me a new one." You remember that? That was a big mistake on Colin's part. He got his mouth washed out with soap.
He was the bad.
And you don't really wash it. You take a bar of soap and you put in the teeth and you pull it, and then from there, it's your problem. So, that's Colin's. That's the worst that Colin ever got disciplined. It was, I was selling cars. By 1975, 76, I was sort of running the Chevrolet dealership. My older brother was there. Casey didn't join the dealership till like 79, and then Danny joined it, 78, and then Danny joined it after he got out of college in about 1980. But in 1975, Gary, the paraplegic, was living in Mom and Dad's house with his brother. And they were both trouble. We would get calls 5 times a week from neighbors. And plus Gary's health was really deteriorating then. And after a lot of deep thought, and I talked with my dad, and Gail and I decided that it was time to, we made a life commitment that he would move in with us and we would take care of him for the rest of his life. We actually took care of him for 13 years. He actually moved into this house with us and lived here 1 year. So, let me see if we can find. This is the house in Bloomingdale that we lived in from 1975 till we moved into this house in 1987. That house had 4 bedrooms. It actually had 3 bedrooms, but one of them was really big. So Gail and Debbie, but it had 2 doors to it, and built a wall, and Gary lived in one of the rooms, and I think the 2 of you lived in the other half. So, and we lived there for, I think, 12 years. It was a great home. That's where Colin and Richard essentially grew up. I'm going to tell the story of the beginning of how our car dealership, Wickstrom Ford, got started. But I'm not going to talk a lot about it because I'm sure all of you have seen our history wall in the building. I don't know if you've taken the time to read the stuff at the beginning of it, but you should take the time to read it because it sort of explains the whole story. So that will tell the story better than what I can tell you here. In 1984, I was working with my dad and my 3 brothers, so there were 5 of us in the store. And one day out of the blue, a guy from Ford called me and said, you know, we would like to consider us to open up the closed down Ford dealership in Barrington. And he said, do you know where it's at? And I said, well, sure, I've been driving by it for years. I'm sure you guys have seen these pictures. But he came, I said, well, sure, I'll look at anything. He comes up, picks me up, we go up there, he only has a key to the parts store, the same parts store that is there now. We open it up and there's nothing inside. It's been boarded up for 5 years. And actually there was one that the whole phone system was still there laying on the floor with the phone wires running everywhere else. It was all flooded out. There were rats running around. In the back room you can see that high school kids, probably Barrington high school kids, if you could imagine that, they probably knew how to get in there and they'd have parties. So, but it wasn't real messy. So he sort of tells me, you know, what the requirements were. Mainly he had to invest money. The investment that they required was $500,000, $500,000, of which, well, I didn't have $500,000, but I did have $100,000. And I had stock in my dad's company that, through my hard work, had grown to be worth about $100,000. So now I had $200,000. And from there, I knew I was going to have to go borrow $300,000. So I go, you know, I knew a couple bankers, and the banker, I went to the bank in Barrington, I went to the bank in Roselle, and they all said, we don't loan money to car dealers. I said, oh. So I called my guy at Ford, I go, you know, I thought I wouldn't have any problem borrowing $300,000, but I'm having problems. I'm sure I didn't get the place open, they just find somebody else to get it open. But they wanted me, I was cool, I was a good citizen, you know, young. Gail knew the office, and because she ran the office in Roselle too, so they said, why don't you go talk to the guy, the Ford credit guy in the office by the dealership. It was in Hoffman Estates. So I prepare a business plan, and I go into it, and I show him my business plan, and he looks at it, and car dealers don't have business plans. We just loan money. He says, you got a business plan, you're in. So they loaned us the money. And we fixed it up. Ford paid to fix it up. And in August 1st of 1984, we opened the car dealership. We opened it with 16 employees. It's pretty much what it says on the wall. It actually was it was like my dad's business. Maybe it was because Gail and I were so good, but we did okay right from the beginning. And then we started doing better and better. And then by 1993 or 4, Colin and Richard were both out of school. And, you know, they sold cars. Each of them sold cars for a year and a half, and then they became managers. And I started working hard at training them, not to replace me, but to become good managers and good owners. And then by 1997, 1998, we were rocking and rolling. We were selling all kinds of cars. And how we got there and how we did that is explained on the wall, so I'm not going to go into those details. But I know we had a blast, and they worked really hard. I worked really hard for many years, but by the time I had them and them trained, the hours were different back then because people would come in at 10:30 at night buying cars. They wouldn't get off of work till Saturdays, a lot of times till 7:30, 8 o'clock at night. You know, we were selling, our best year then was, we sold about 2,500 cars. So, that's sort of our story.
It's a great story.
Like I said, I won't do this again. You know, I've done it, this story thing. You know, the next one that'll do a story will be maybe Richard and Amy. Amy might be able to put together a little bit of the Jordan story, and Diane and Colin might someday do a story and do the Wickstrom story. I think it's well worth it because you guys will remember today, I'm sure, for the rest of your lives. The other thing I wanted to just touch on and go back to when I talked about Gail's mom and dad and Gary, you know, life has its tragedies. Your mom, and your mom took our family through that year. It was a tough year. But it was especially a tough year for her. She had 2 young kids. She had Patty, who was 10 years old, probably in 4th or 5th grade. And we also had to deal with Gary. And I guess my message here is everybody in this room, you know, we had a near tragedy with Richard 2 years ago with his head. So unfortunately in life, there's going to be tragedies. And I guess my advice on that is you need to work through tragedies and move on. If not, they can just sort of stall your life. We've had a few tragedies over the years, and but by and large, you know, we as a group here, we've been very lucky. The last story is this story. My grandchildren. You know,
Yeah.
You love your grandchildren more than anything than you can imagine. You're very, very special to us. We're very proud of all of you. You're all good kids. We just love you so much. We got Grace going off to college. You know, Ella, you'll be not too far behind you, so everybody keeps growing up. This picture here is one of my favorite pictures. Help me a little bit. If I recall, Amy, you were pregnant with Grace there.
Yeah.
So that would have been 1999, 2000. We all look the same, don't we?
Hopefully. Some might say better.
And needless to say, there's one other little star on the wall. Ella. That's it. Does anybody have any questions? Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Dad.
Thank you.
And Mom.
Good.
That was awesome.
Oh,
Top. God, you made me cry.
Good. That's what I wanted to do.
Cal's the crier in the family, though.
Thank you.
Hey, Tim?
Yeah.
you're the crier.
I'm a
Give me
crier.
a second here.
I'm
I
a
gotta
little
get my gloves.
crybaby.
I'll leave this. Actually, I'm gonna clear this table away
Hey, John.
because we're gonna all
Hey,
eat.
Grandma.
You want us to help kind of stack this down?
I'll clean it up.
We're signing off.
Do you want
No,
help?
I don't know what to